Hello my friends, how are you doing? Hoping that you are fine. Let us come back and discuss the lesson of this week. Before we go to the lesson of this week, as we remember, last week we talked about the Tower of Babel, whereby we realized that the builders of the Tower of Babel, they forgot what God has did for them, and they started making arrangements in how to take his place. They wanted to lift themselves up so that they can take the place of God. They forgot his miracles of the flood, and they intended to build the tower so that when another flood will come, they will not be taken away by the flood. Forgetting what God has talked about, the covenant that there will be no flood. They forgot that one. They didn't pay it in mind. And others of them, they never knew that God existed. But now, God came down. And when he came down, he confused those people and made them to speak different languages, thus leading them to separate from that area to different parts of the earth. Now, after dispersion from Babel, idolatry again became well nigh universal, and the Lord finally left the hardened transgressors to follow the evil ways. They have been separated from Babel. Now they have engaged again into idolatry. God left them to follow their transgression and their evil ways, and he chose Abraham of the line of Shem. Abraham was the son of Terah, and as we know that Terah was one of the sun worshippers. So God is coming here to choose Abraham from the lineage of Shem, and he made him the keeper of Israel for the future generation. Abraham had grown up in the midst of the superstition and atheism. Even his father worshipped other gods. God has ever persevered. God has ever preserved remnant to serve him. So in every generation, in every situation, God normally preserved the remnant who will serve to keep his commandments. For example, Adam was saved so that he can show the commandments of God. Apart from Cain, God chose Seth as a remnant to show the commandments of God and to obey and to teach the generations to come. We have an example of Enoch. Enoch walked with God, and he was took, and he was no more because God took him. He was a righteous man before God. So apart from other people who did evil in the eyes of God, Enoch received the grace of God, and he was taken by God because he walked with God. We have Methuselah, the man who stayed the longest years in the earth, 969. Methuselah, he also walked with God. We have Noah, a part of the abominations which were in the current nation. Noah stood as a righteous man in the eyes of God. And then we have Shem, and now here we have Abraham. Men are still tested like Abraham, that is, being called true teachings of God. Men nowadays, we are being tested as Abraham was tested. Abraham was told to move out of the land where he was living to go into a nation or into a country which he never knew. And he obeyed God and he moved. So many of us, such as Abraham was called, we are called to abandon the career that promises wealth and honor. Will you leave that career? God is calling you out of your comfortable zones. Come out to worship him in his ways, in the way acknowledged to him. Live out the career which promises wealth and honor in your life. God is calling to separate you from the kindred and enter upon the path of self-denial and hardship and sacrifice. Will you be ready to accept him? God has a work for you to do, and he has set you apart, but a life of ease and influence of friends have hindered you from the call of God. The life which you stay, the easy life where there is no challenges, is it hindering you from the call of God? The influence from your friends, are they hindering you from the call of God? What is this root of Abraham? Why is Abraham called by God? Now we need to discuss more about the root of Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he could receive as an inheritance, and he went out without knowing where he was going. Abraham was called by God, and he went out without knowing where he was going, by faith. Genesis chapter 12 to 22 covers the journey of Abraham. From chapter 12 to chapter 22, it covers the journey of Abraham. In Genesis 12 verse 1, Abraham is told to go and live his past life, while in Genesis chapter 22 verse 2, Abraham is told to go and live his future as it could exist in his son. That's first and second call. So the first call, Abraham is told to go and live his past, to leave his country, and to go where God will show him. In the second call, Genesis chapter 22 verse 2, God is calling Abraham to go out to offer his son as a sacrifice, just to live his future in the hope of God. Abraham is told by God not to be afraid. Genesis 15 verse 1. Abram exemplifies faith and is remembered as the man of faith. Genesis 15 verse 6, and also Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 7 and 8. God selected Abram as his messenger, through whom to communicate the light to the world. The word of God came to him, not with the presentation of flattering prospects in his life of large salary, of great appreciation, or worldly honor. When God called Abraham, he never promised to give him a very large salary, a huge salary, or a great appreciation, or world honor, but he told him, just come the way you are and move out from where I'm calling you to the country where I'm showing you, without bearing in mind what he will see from God. He just moved out with the faith where God showed him. God, go thee out of thy kindred, out of thy country, from thy father's house, unto the land that I will show you. That is the command which Abraham was given. The patriarch obeyed. He forsook his country, his home, his relative, and all prescient association connected with his earlier life, to become a pilgrim and stranger. Abraham obeyed the voice of God to go out from his relative, from his country, and from his home, and from all the pleasant life which he used to stay, to go out and be a stranger and pilgrim in the country where he never knew. Abraham might have reasoned and questioned the purpose of God in this, but he showed that he had confidence that God was leading him. Yes, he had many questions in his life. Why is God telling me to do this? But he had this confidence that God will lead him and will acknowledge why he has called him. Question: he didn't question whether it was fertile, pleasant country, or whether or not he should have his. He went at God's bidding. This is the lesson to every one of us nowadays. Abram went out. He never went to thought that when I reach there, will it there be easy for me to stay there? Will it be a pleasant home for me? He went out. Same to us nowadays. When God is calling us, let us stop thinking about our future. When God is calling you, just move from your comfortable zones and come and serve him. Before God can use Abraham, he had to separate him from former association and dwell among strangers, since he is connected with God. Before God is going to use us, he must separate us, just as he separated Abraham from other people in his original country. God has to separate us from our old sinful ways so as to use us. Are you ready for God to separate you? Those who are called to unite with Christ must leave all in order to follow him. Those who are called to unite with Christ must leave all in order to follow him. Why did God call Abraham? God called Abraham to take. God's last call to Abraham. God last talked to Noah, and Abraham becomes the 10th generation from Noah. Abraham is the 10th generation from Noah. And God's last talk was to Noah. And God here is referring himself to talk to Abraham. Why is he talking to Abraham? To be a connector between the blessings of God to the blessings of the world. That's why God is calling Abraham so that he will connect the world to the promise God made to Noah. He wanted him to connect the promises which he made to Noah to be fulfilled through Abraham. Number 2, to be a blessing to all nations. God is calling Abraham to be a blessing to all nations. Genesis 12 verse 2 to 3 and also Genesis 22 verse 18, Genesis 26 verse 4 and Genesis 28 verse 14. All these things, they are talking about Abraham being a blessing through other nations. What do we need to know? The promise of blessings is repeated 5 times in this passage of the call of Abraham. Acts 3 verse 25 says, "You are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with fathers, saying to Abraham, and in you all the seeds and families of the earth shall be blessed." In Abraham, all the families, all the seeds will be blessed. How did Abram respond to God's call? Abram responded by leaving the past. Abram responded by leaving the past. What is this past we are talking about? By leaving his family, by leaving his country, and even by leaving a part of himself. Let us understand that Ur of the Chaldean is also called Babylonia. Genesis 11 verse 31 and also Isaiah 13 verse 19. Abraham has to go out. Abraham has to go out of Babylon and declare destruction to it, as the prophets were told to flee from Babylon. Just as the prophets were told to flee from Babylon, Abraham is told to flee from Babylon. As you are told, Yul is also known as Babylonia. So come out of Babylon. We are called to come out of Babylon, lest we share in her sin and receive her of her plagues. My fellow brother, come out of Babylon. Babylon, Babel, this is confusion. Come out of Babylon. Abram is told to come out of Babylon so that he can bring blessings to other generations. My dear friend, come out of Babylon. Number 2, Abram had to leave his family and his heritage and much of what he learned and acquired through hereditary education and influence. The way Abram responded. Number 1, he had to leave his country. Number 2, he had to leave his family and the heritage which he had acquired. So he had to leave them. Number 3, he had to go himself. Go for yourself. Abraham has to leave himself to get rid of the part of himself. There are some education which he acquired, some culture which he acquired from the Babylonian. The practice of the Babylonian, he had to leave them. He had to leave part of himself and be connected with God. Remember, God's promise isn't about physical homeland, but about salvation of the world. Genesis chapter 12, verse 2 and 3. God's promise isn't about physical homeland, but about salvation of the world. What is God calling you to leave behind, my dear friend? What part of your life might you abandon in order to heed the call of God? That's a question you need to ask yourself. What is God calling you to leave behind? What part of your life might you abandon in order to heed the call of God? Why did Abraham leave the promised land to go to Egypt? After leaving the promised land, we see Abram again leaving the promised land to go to Egypt because of the famine. Genesis 12 verse 20. Genesis 12 verse 10. What is Abraham's behavior in Egypt? Abraham, who leaves Canaan, contrasts with Abraham who left Yule. Number one, he was called by God to leave Yule for Canaan, but he leaves himself from Canaan to Egypt without being told by God. We see the difference here. Abram was told by God to move out of Yule to Canaan, and now when he is leaving Canaan to Egypt, God is not commanding him. Number two, he relied on God after leaving Yule, but now when he left Canaan to Egypt, counts only himself and his stay in Egypt. By concealing the fact that Sarah was his wife, he betrayed a distrust of divine care and lack of loved faith and courage, so often and nobly exemplified in his life. We know Abraham as the father of faith. By now concealing the fact Sarah was his wife, he betrayed the distrust of divine care which God had to provide for him. Even a greater man of God can make mistake yet not be forsaken by God. What do we learn by Abram lying about Sarah? Even a greater man of God can make a mistake and yet not be forsaken by God. Abraham is an example of salvation by grace. If it weren't grace, Abraham, like all of us, could have had no hope. God brought famine in Canaan as a trial upon Abraham to teach him lessons of submission, patience, and faith. This is a lesson which Abraham had to learn. God brought the famine in Egypt. God brought a famine in Canaan for one reason, to teach Abraham about submission, patience, and faith. Remember also, Abraham didn't forsake Canaan to go back from where he was called, that is, the land of Chaldeans. And when there is famine, Abraham never minded to go back to the land of the Chaldeans, where there was plenty of food, but he went a nearby land. He went to the Egypt so that after the famine, he could come back. He went as a refugee near as possible to the land of the promise, intending shortly to return where God has placed him. He didn't have this mind in his soul that he will return back to Yule, but he went a nearby place whereby thinking that after the famine he could come back. When God has called you, when you face trials, what do? Do you go back to your current situation where you used to be? God is calling you out of Babylon. Come out of Babylon and don't have the mind in your head that you would go back to Babylon just as Abraham. God leads his children by a way that they know not, but he does not forget or cast off those who put their trust in him. The faith trials that task our faith most severely and make it seem that God has forsaken us are to lead us closer to Christ, that we may lay our burdens at his feet and experience the peace which he will give us in exchange. From Abraham's deception, we learn that no deviation from strict integrity can meet God's approval. Even if it is a small thing, it can't meet God's approval. The deception made by Abraham brought judgment to the royal house, and thus made the king of the Egypt to acknowledge and know the God of Abraham. After the incidents, at Egypt, Abraham goes back and builds a tent at Bethel. The incidents has occurred there. Abram is told to go back to his country, and he goes back and build a tent at Bethel to offer sacrifice to God and to worship God and to repent of what he has done. Abraham, at this point, has repented and is back to himself. Abraham, the man of faith. Abraham's connection with God already shows in his relationship with the people. How that is the way he handles the problem with Lot, his nephew, concerning the land. Here now we see Abraham reconnecting with God, and this is shown in the way he handles the issue, the problem at hand, the land with Lot, how to share the land with the Lord. He gives Lot a chance first to choose for himself and place comfortable to him an act of generosity and kindness. When a problem arises here, he tells Lot, just choose a place comfortable to you. And this shows the act of generosity and kindness. The fact that Lot chooses the easiest and best part for himself, the well-watered plain, without any concern about the wickedness of the future neighbor, shows how greedy he was. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked, sinful against the Lord, and this reveals the greediness and character of Lot. He never knew where he was going, that the future neighbors were sinful. They were wickedness people. He never minded that one. But what he thought is the fertility of the land and the well-watered plain. This one shows the greedy in Lot. Abraham's move was an act of faith. He didn't choose the land. It was given to him by God's grace. It is only when Abraham separates with Lot that God speaks to him again. The Lord, though, makes it very clear that he is giving it to Abraham. It is a gift of grace, which Abraham must appropriate by faith, and a faith that leads to obedience. It is the work of God alone that will bring about all that he has promised to Abraham. We can't do nothing to gain the grace of God. It is the grace of God which appeared to Abraham, and Abraham is considered as the man of faith because of his obedience to God and his great faith. Hope to see you in the next part.